Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Geoff Manaugh and Nicola Twilley, discussing their joint book, Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine. They are joined tonight by CYNTHIA GRABER. Through good times and bad, Harvard Bookstore will continue to bring authors and their work to our virtual community. We have an amazing summer season that is in full swing. So make sure to check out our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you would like to purchase a copy of Until Proven Safe, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link will support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Without your continued support and patronage, this virtual series wouldn't be possible. Thank you so much for tuning in support of our authors, our incredible booksellers, and our landmark independent bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support, especially now. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. So thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Geoff Manaugh is the author of the New York Times bestseller, A Burglar's Guide to the City, as well as the architecture and technology website Building Blog. He regularly writes for the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, Wired, and more. Nicola Twilley is the co-host of the award-winning podcast Gastropod, a personal favorite of mine, which looks at food through the lens of history and science. She is also an award-winning contributor to The New Yorker. CYNTHIA GRABER is an award-winning writer and radio producer whose work has been featured in magazines and radio shows including Wired, Fast Company, The New Yorker, Studio 360, and others. She is also Nicola's co-host for Gastropod. Tonight, they are discussing Until Proven Safe. As recent history has shown, this book is perpetually relevant. But Geoff and Nicola they were researching about quarantine well before COVID. This book tracks the history of quarantine around the globe, chasing the story of emergency isolation through time and space. But as it looks to the past, it gives us a better understanding of quarantine and our future. I'll leave you with this quote from the Wall Street Journal. What makes their book compelling, besides their extensive experiences as journalists, is their depth of their research, coupled with a firm conviction that quarantine, a mighty yet dangerous weapon, must be used more wisely in the future. This is an exceptionally powerful book. And on that note of praise, I'll turn things over to our speakers. Nicola, Geoff, CYNTHIA, thank you so much for being here tonight. The virtual stage is yours.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Lovely to be here. So I'm going to start things off with a drink. Hope you all can see it. And it is called a Lazaretto. I should actually remember this. Lazaretto. Sorry, I didn't remember that. Why don't you talk me through why this drink is a quarantine drink? And I'll try not to drink it the entire time.
Well, cheers, first of all.
Cheers.
CYNTHIA, nice to see you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Oh, yeah, great. We all have it. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, the Lazaretto was developed especially for us because every great book should have a great cocktail. And it was designed by Evan Clem, who's a mixologist, to use the gin that really powered the writing of this book during lockdown. A Wilder gin and tonic, gin made by our friends at Ventura Spirits here in California. But there's a whole series of themes going on. And so it's both a conceptual quarantine and a ingredient-based quarantine. The conceptual piece is, you can see this lime floating here is a sort of a leaky quarantine. And we can come back to this in our conversation, but it's keeping some creme de cassis sort of separate, but not quite separate from the rest of the drink. And that's really one of the historical features of quarantine, is that it slows spread, but it's never, watertight. So that's that's the conceptual link, and then there's also some ingredient links. That creme de cassis is blackcurrant, of course, and blackcurrant is a delicious flavor, as Cynthia will agree, but is quite rare in the United States because for years the blackcurrant was banned under quarantine rules because it's a host for a pest of chestnut trees. And a pine blister, I believe they call it. Anyway, so the blackcurrant is not a common flavor. That's why purple Skittles are blackcurrant flavored in the rest of the world and grape flavored here. So that's the blackcurrant element. Then there's citrus in the lime, which sort of refers to the California border, and some honey in there too, which is also references the California border. The California border quarantine station is a place where we spend a lot of time in that section of the book. And so those ingredients are protecting the California botanicals of the gin. Then you have the tonic that's an anti-malarial. And I think I've done it. Have I done it?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Anyway, cheers. You should try it.
Bottoms up.
It's great.
It's really tasty. I'm not going to drink it all right now. So, but to give a little brief shout out to Gastropod, and then we'll keep going. If those of you don't know, we actually did an episode on the food section of the book just a month or so ago, and covered the California station and have some great tape of them on site at the station. And you should all go listen to that episode and then of course read about it in the book. Before we get into some of my favorite non-agriculture parts of the book, and I do have many, although obviously I loved the agriculture section, I want to start with what I think most people looking at this, even just the title, will want to know, which is, here it is, a book about the history of future in quarantine. And as I know, because I've been working with Nikki for 7 years, that you all have been working on this book for a long time, way before COVID. So when COVID hit, how did that affect what you were doing, and how did it change your approach to the book?
Yeah, there's actually a bunch of ways that it affected the book. You know, we've pointed out and many of the interviews that you know, the original title for the book actually was The Coming Quarantine. You know, that's what we sold it under. That's what it was contracted under. And you know, obviously when COVID-19 hit and everyone got stuck in lockdown or stuck in quarantine or stuck in some form of social distancing measure, The Coming Quarantine was no longer accurate because it had arrived. And so we settled on Until Proven Safe. You know, there are other aspects of it, I think, just structurally that were interesting. You know, we were able actually to find that many of the experts who we had been interviewing before COVID actually turned out to play quite substantial roles during COVID. An example of that would be an individual who actually is mentioned towards the beginning of the book, an Italian doctor named Dr. Luigi Bertinato, who was the head of medical services in the Veneto region of Venice, of Italy. And you know, had worked with Ebola in West Africa and had walked us through the history of quarantine, you know, now 5 years ago. But then when COVID hit, he became a senior scientific advisor to the Italian government during the COVID response. And similarly, we had actually Dr. Martin Citron, who's the head of global migration and quarantine for the CDC, who actually we had first seen and met in his office back in 2017 at the CDC. And we just kept in touch the entire time. And so we actually had, you know, on the record, behind the scenes, interviews with the head CDC official for quarantine, even during the Trump administration when there was a crackdown on media. And I think that was a nice sort of coup for the book, that we actually had a long running story with Marty.
Even the epidemiologist, Adam Kucharski, who we talk with in the final chapter of the book about what the future of quarantine might look like. We had spoken to him again years before COVID, but he turned out to be serving on the committee that was providing modeling to the British government during the pandemic and doing all the advice on that. So we caught up with him, and it was a real opportunity to see how the things that we had talked about with these people, how they were experiencing them play out in real life. So that part was really fun. The part where, you know, we suddenly realized, wow, you know, quarantine is a hot topic right now, and we have a book that about it that we need to finish and get out there and, you know, publish it. It's like, come on. That part was stressful. there are some good things about writing a book in lockdown. I would say there was nothing else to do, so there was a sort of certain lack of FOMO. You know, it wasn't like we were turning down social invitations to stay home and write the book. But yeah, it's definitely different. I think it was really just mostly fascinating to be able to weave through COVID with some of the historical examples. You can say that people found, people escaped from quarantine in the past, or people argued about whether quarantine was necessary in the past. But now that people have had those arguments around COVID and COVID restrictions, it's much more visceral to everyone.
That is definitely true. And we are probably, depending on time, going to come back to some of that contemporary experience.
Great.
I have some questions about history, but I don't want to go chronologically. I don't want to go all the way back, because I first want to start with what was actually my favorite part when I started reading the book. It's a little bit in, and it definitely made my mouth drop open, which is the American plan. So what was the American, not a surprise maybe for folks who know my particular interests, but what was the American plan and what did quarantine have to do with it?
So the American plan is the largest, most recent mass quarantine in American history that no one's heard of. And it's also, it made my jaw drop when I read about it. There is, it was started in 1917 as, young U.S. soldiers, men were going off to war, and there was this fear that they might be weakened by catching venereal disease. And at the same time, there was this new generation of women. This was really the first generation of women in small numbers, but still there were some of them, there were enough of them to make people worried, who were moving to cities, living on their own, supporting themselves in jobs, and essentially not answering to a man, a father, a husband, whatever. And that obviously was deeply disturbing to the patriarchy. And then there's, venereal disease spreading, which, just so we're clear on the science, men can spread venereal disease too. And there were condoms invented at the time. But leaving that aside, the American plan was the use of quarantine powers to detain any woman who was suspected of being a loose woman who might be spreading venereal disease. And the problem, and this gets at the heart of quarantine, because it's always this idea of a suspicious person, this idea of uncertainty. If you know someone has a disease, you're going to isolate them. If you don't know, that's when you might suspect it, and that's when you quarantine. It's the opposite of our legal system. Whereas normally it's innocent until proven guilty, with quarantine, you're dangerous until proven safe. And so places were locking up women suspected of being loose women, and then going on to sort of often treat them with mercury for syphilis that they didn't necessarily even have. So it was horrific. And the reasons that they might be locked up for being quote unquote loose were equally ridiculous. Women who ate alone in a restaurant, deeply suspect activity. And those women were detained. Women, might get in an argument with a boyfriend. The boyfriend would report them as a loose woman, and they'd be detained. There was a woman who was prescribed some alcohol for tuberculosis, which was a legitimate treatment at the time, but she was seen drinking the alcohol. She was detained. And of course, it was also applied unfairly racially, in Kansas, where, there were 3% of the population, I think, was African American at the time. 30% of the women detained under this were Blacks. So it was just this really horrific period, and tens of thousands of women were locked up under it, and the law stayed on the books for decades.
So you say the law was on the book for decades, but how long did it go on? Were there any long-term ramifications? I mean, we had never heard of this. You hadn't heard of it. I hadn't heard of it. So how big a deal was it? How big an effect did it have?
Yeah, I think for tens of thousands of women, it clearly had an effect. And it also, because those laws stayed on the books, they were used later. So, for example, protesters in the 60s would often be, female protesters would often be forced to submit to internal exams under American plan laws because they were still on the books. And so it did, and those laws stayed there and were abused because they were there. So it did have an effect. And I think, overall, as we all know, women are still not equal in the workplace, and this cannot have helped.
So there is a story about a woman that hopefully we're going to have time to get back to. But before we kind of get closer to the present, I now want to go way back. And I know you guys get asked this all the time, but it's a good way to sort of set up where we are, why Italy, who John Howard was. But first, tell us about the word. Where does the word come from?
Sure. The word quarantine, which I think has an air of a kind of exoticism and thus something that can be, frightening and obsolete and from a different era. People hear it and they immediately think of something medieval. Actually, it's quite straightforward. It comes from the Venetian dialect for quarantena, which is 40, which is also in turn just 40 giorni, which means 40 days. And so a quarantine is a period of 40 days during which something suspected of being dangerous is isolated from other things like it. So whether that's a human being that is kept on an island out of suspicion, or whether that's a ship full of goods that has been anchored in the bay so that those goods don't intermingle with the things in the city, that 40-day period is quarantine. But what's interesting is actually that before quarantine and before quarantena there was a trentena, which is a 30-day period of time, and the 30 days were actually were medically in some senses identical to 40 days. But the period of time was expanded, not really because there was a scientific breakthrough at the time, but because 40 days made sense. 40 days had a whole bunch of cultural references. It resonated all the way back with the Bible, Christ's alleged 40 days in the desert, 40 days and 40 nights, 40 days of rain that in the story of Noah's Ark, even the concept of 40 as a kind of Hebrew generation. So, you've got this idea that if something is 40, it's just a number that you can get behind. It makes sense to you. It's almost like saying a baker's dozen. It's just something that you understand culturally. And so that's the origin of quarantine, the word quarantine and the 40-day time period.
And so how were these quarantines originally used in Italy, since our word kind of takes place in Italy?
Yeah, so I mean, it's funny to think of such a concept having an actual history, but it really was sort of invented in a time and a place. And Venice is where it was perfected, which makes sense when you look at Venice because it is a city of islands. And it was very easy for the Venetian authorities to say, well, they had made the connection basically between the outbreaks of the Black Death, which was a brand new pandemic disease in Europe at the time. It had made its way westward towards Europe from the east and was just wiping out entire populations. And they made the connection between those outbreaks and ships arriving filled with goods from the east and merchants who had traveled to the east, etc. And so the concept, pioneered in Dubrovnik, which is part of the Republic of Venice at the time, but then kind of perfected in Venice, was let's stick everyone, we could say, oh, these ships are bringing disease, we should shut down trade. But you can't afford to do that. I mean, it comes back to COVID-19 and everyone being like, oh gosh, we can't afford to shut down. And the Venetian authorities thought exactly the same thing. So instead, they built a Lazaretto, also a delicious cocktail, but what they called a Lazaretto, a quarantine facility on an island, a little bit distant from the city, but close enough to see as a sort of emblem of public health. And they made merchants and ships stay there. Then during outbreaks in the city itself, they would quarantine entire sort of parts of the city there. So at times there were like 100 ships just around the island with people on them. But yes, that's how it started, and the Lazaretto name comes from the original name of the island the Venetians used. It was St. Mary of Nazareth and Lazaretto in Italian, and then because Lazarus is the patron saint of lepers, the whole thing got us smushed together and became Lazaretto.
Yeah, and I think what's also important about that too, I think, is that the region of the world where quarantine was invented, it happened there because also that region was kind of an interface point, between one culture and another, or between one ecosystem and another, or one disease reservoir and another. And we still see the same kinds of things even today, where we quarantine at points of encounter. And so these are like airports, they're maritime ports. There's a chapter in the book that looks at astronaut quarantine. So places of interface between our planets and other planets, or our planet and the International Space Station, become sites of quarantine, because you're trying to delay the encounter between two worlds. And that's one of the things that quarantine does.
So you have these places in Italy that are protecting people at the time, from the plague. And now I want to jump forward a few hundred years. There is a character in your book, and he played a role in your reporting and your personal journey. So can you introduce us to John Howard? Who was he? What was going on with him?
Sure. Yeah. John Howard was is a very interesting historical figure. He was primarily known, and is still primarily known, as a prison reformer. He was an Englishman in the late 1700s who had inherited quite a large fortune from a father who worked in the upholstery trade. And so he used that money to fund humanitarian travel. So he traveled throughout Europe, visiting prisons and jails and dungeons, and going into these facilities and actually trying to measure everything from the bread rations that a prisoner received to whether or not there was natural daylight. Is there a window? Do they have access to fresh water? Are the floors just 6 inches of mud that these people have to sleep in? And he developed this kind of almost like a prison criticism, where he was cataloging all the things that he saw that were wrong with continental prison practices.
It was like a Yelp for prisons, basically.
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. And then he went back to England and gave a series of talks to the Houses of Parliament, trying to improve prison conditions in England. But to make a long story short, he then realized, though, as he was traveling, that quarantine stations and lazarettos were remarkably similar to prisons. They were kind of like medical jails. And so he, in his 60s, set off on a whole new circuit of journeys and trips, where he went throughout Europe as far east as Russia, effectively being a kind of quarantine critic. And so what we wanted to do in one of the chapters of the book is basically say, one, can we follow in his footsteps, or at least part of the journey? But then two, what would a 21st century John Howard go to see? What are the sites of quarantine today that someone who wanted to maybe learn about quarantine or even reform quarantine should visit? And so that's one of the things that really guided our travels around Dubrovnik and around Malta and Venice. John Howard actually made sure that he got on an infected ship, so that he was exposed to a disease and then was actually quarantined in Venice. So in some ways, he was kind of like the original gonzo journalist, in the sense that, he realized that he was still just an outsider when he goes up and, just writes down descriptions of what he's seen. To actually go into quarantine and experience it from the inside, it was a pretty brave move to actually expose himself to a potentially fatal disease.
Certainly was not particularly safe at the time. So you traced his travels, this kind of quarantine reporter, and could you find all the sites that he visited?
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things. There are not actually a ton of quarantine fossils out there. Nowadays when you visit Venice, do you go to the quarantine stations even though they're the oldest in the world? You do not. You go to St. Mark's Square and so on. And so, in fact, the quarantine stations in Venice we did manage to get into, thanks to, they weren't necessarily open to the public at the time, but, we made arrangements and sort of explored these crumbling ruins. But a lot of places that were quarantine stations have either been repurposed completely. So the quarantine station in Dubrovnik is now an arts complex, and all the separate, it's delightful space, all those separate courtyards where, each of the like a ship's crew would sort of be put around one particular courtyard so they could do their quarantine separately from another ship. And then the goods would be in the courtyard, the merchants up top. It was a whole system. Now those individual courtyards and the terraces up on top, you can imagine it's like this gorgeous art gallery, performance space, bars and restaurants. So a lot of them have been converted. Many of them have been demolished. The one in Marseille, which John Howard actually had to finagle his way into by dressing up as a doctor, because the French quarantine system was seen as the world's best, and the French thought it was a trade secret. So they wouldn't allow John Howard in. The French and the British have had a long and not particularly amicable relationship over the centuries. And so they wouldn't allow John Howard in. And so he dressed up as a doctor to sneak in and do a report that way. that's totally gone, not a trace of it. And oftentimes you'll see just a trace in a place name. So Baltimore, many of you will not know, the Quarantine Road Sanitary Landfill is where the quarantine used to be. Now it's a Superfund site. So there's a lot of them that have just been gone completely, and a lot of places that didn't invest in a permanent quarantine station too. So a lot of places would just build tents as they needed them and then kind of burn them to the ground after a pandemic as a sort of disinfection material. And it's kind of like COVID when you think about, will those hospitals that were thrown up overnight in Wuhan, for example, what trace will they leave on the landscape? But yeah, we did manage to get into some of the places, even including Malta, which for a minute it looked like we wouldn't get into. We were found, a guy who was working on the team who's redeveloping the site to let us in. Met him. The first gate we got through fine. The second gate we got through fine. The third gate, his keys didn't work, and for some reason or other, it was late in the day already, and we just thought, and we had to leave, Malta soon after. But we thought, what would John Howard do? This is a man who got on an infected ship and dressed up as a doctor. So we climbed over the fence, and we climbed over the next fence, and then we ran around this crumbling building without a guide because our guide had stayed behind. He didn't fancy climbing the fence, I guess. And they had told us it wasn't safe. Parts of it were no longer safe, but they hadn't told us which parts. So we felt like we sort of earned our John Howard stripes in that moment.
So in tracing or attempting to trace his steps, was there anything that you felt like he took away from the experience and then that you took away? Like, what did you feel like you learned from visiting or kind of even attempting to visit these sites yourself?
Well, I think you definitely learn things that he saw and things that we didn't necessarily see on these actual trips that were more like architectural history, but that we learned certainly through our experience in COVID-19 and through the research is that, quarantine is an experience. When you're asking to put people for them to put themselves into a position of great self-sacrifice, to give up their own home, to give up access to any kind of creature comfort, and to stay in some facility or to stay in what we maybe now would just do a hotel or even in your own home. You're asking them to live through an experience that authorities maybe didn't give a lot of thought to. And so I think that John even firsthand experienced just the sheer kind of the boredom of the time there. But also the lack of significance, the feeling that you're just kind of stranded on an island, the fear of actually being exposed to the disease there, that you're there allegedly for your safety, but it ends up being that might be the most dangerous part of your entire time during a plague outbreak. And so I think we saw that kind of thing. I'll turn it over to Nikki in a second, because I think that there's a lot of things that came out of that kind of view of quarantine as an experience that is underthought and underdesigned. And we haven't given a lot of thought to it. So we spoke in the book at one point to a boredom researcher.
Oh yeah, well, this is I keep saying this is my favorite section of the book because they're all my favorite sections of the book, but this is one of my favorite sections of the book. And it is so funny because throughout history, the people have written the same things about quarantine. Even this is just a side note, but even the boom of COVID-19 erotica that happened at the start of the pandemic, there was a whole boom in quarantine romance novels in the 1800s. And you can go back into, say, literary magazines of the time, New Yorker style things, and find these like very sort of therapy romance stories set in Lazarettos. But people then found it boring, and people now find it boring. So we decided to call up a boredom researcher and ask what was going on there. A woman called Erin Westgate at the University of Florida, and she told us, listen, boredom is just a sign that you don't find what you're doing meaningful. And she also has an amazing study called the Jerk Study, which is a great use of research to show that when people are bored, she has them watch a really boring video of a rock. They will do bad things if you only give them bad things to do. So people who are really, really bored will, for example, shred insects, these worms. They didn't really get shredded, you know, it was a pretend shred, but they they thought they were shredding them rather than do nothing because they're bored. But her point was, listen, since we don't find this meaningful, and yet it is meaningful, you're doing something to protect the greater good. Is there a way to redesign it? We have, you know, corporations full of people who know how to design motivational, meaningful experiences for holiday goers and members of clubs and watchers of movies and so on. Why can't we tap into some of that expertise? And I thought that was just a really interesting point. It's never really been thought through as what do you do? But lots of aspects of it have stayed the same. Even in Malta, you could see the difference between, you know, the fancy places where some people got to quarantine and the rooms were big enough that you could play tennis in them. People did. And the smaller spaces where other people got to quarantine and the crew themselves weren't even allowed off the ships. So that inequality has always been baked into quarantine. You know, the ventilation has always been a concern in quarantine, and that's something we saw during COVID-19. So there were sort of similarities and differences over time that were really kind of it made it worth following in his footsteps to sort of tease out that level of detail. I mean, John Howard was a very obsessive individual. He was known for kind of weighing the bread ration and so on. But attention has, you know, rewards.
Useful years later to then be able to actually find the information. So I want to put out there that I'm going to be taking questions in a few minutes. I have another topic that I kind of want to tease out a little bit. We don't have questions yet, so please, good. So starting to come in, and I will look at them in probably about 5 minutes. So I'm going to ask a couple more questions and then turn it over.
Great.
So one of the things that we brought up, that you all brought up, particularly with the American plan, and then even a little bit, you know, with the kind of the difference in what who had access to what type of quarantine, are the ways that it can be misused or misunderstood. And there's a contemporary example in the book that I think is really interesting and certainly relevant when we're talking about quarantine today. So who is, I have only seen it written, Casey Hickox? Casey Hickox.
Yeah, Casey Hickox. So she, if you know her at all, if you remember her at all, it's from 2014 where she was called the Ebola nurse, that she got into a whole thing with Chris Christie, who was governor of New Jersey at the time. And so the deal is, this is one of those examples where I was completely wrong and I feel embarrassed about my former self. But Casey Hickox was a volunteer with Doctors Without Borders, and she went to Sierra Leone and she nursed in a Ebola unit. She didn't, it was grueling work, but she did not have an incident where she was exposed to the disease. Like, she never had an instance where her PPE didn't work or anything like that. There was no exposure that she knew of. And then she flew back to the US, and at the airport, she said where she'd come from. And before she knew it, she was in an isolation tent in an unfinished building in Princeton in the hospital, and was being told she was going to have to quarantine for 3 weeks. And at the time, you have to remember, there was a lot of panic in the news about Ebola. People were people were going to weddings in Dallas where there had been an Ebola case, and then not being allowed to go into work when they came home just because they'd been in the same city where there was one Ebola case. You know, people were genuinely afraid of this disease. And there was lots of, you know, angry rhetoric on Fox and other such places about how, you know, we don't want to like bleed to death in the streets, and these people who go overseas and volunteer, they're nice and all, but they shouldn't be allowed back and they have to suffer the consequences. That was a Trump tweet at the time. And so there was a lot of fear, and Chris Christie responded by saying that Casey Hickox needed to quarantine, and Casey Hickox, being a public health nurse, actually knew what she was talking about and said, no, I don't. Quarantine is only appropriate if, in the case of Ebola, if I have a suspected exposure, or if I have symptoms, then I need to be isolated. But I cannot be contagious until I have symptoms and I wasn't exposed. So this is an inappropriate use of quarantine. And she challenged him, and he was not happy. And there was a lot of ACLU got involved. Dr. Fauci, who back then was not a household name, stood up for Casey Hickox. Lots of other people piled on her. She was sent back to Maine where she lived. And there was a whole legal case about it that she won. And what was interesting about it is, and I didn't again realize this at the time, but rather, she sued the state of New Jersey, she won, and rather than take the money, which would have been considerable, she instead said, no, I want a Bill of Rights for the quarantined. I don't want this to happen to other people. Quarantine is supposed to be the least restrictive. It's supposed to be scientifically justified. There should be a right of appeal. There's a duty of care. If you ask people to give up their individual freedom for the greater good, then you owe them something. And so she put all that in writing, and that was adopted by the state of New Jersey. But it was an interesting example. And her thing was, at the time I was like, oh, why won't you just shut up and stay home? It's only 3 weeks. What's the big deal? But her point was, this is not fair. And also for Doctors Without Borders volunteers, they're already giving up 3 weeks or a month to go overseas and volunteer. Then you ask them to give up another 3 weeks on their return. That's too long for people. Plus the stigma. I mean, Casey Hickox's boyfriend at the time was enrolled in a nursing program, and he was told to stay home from school, in case he had Ebola. So then it's affecting her whole family. She was getting death threats, and she was like, this is just not acceptable. But as is sadly often the case when a smart woman knows more than popular opinion, it isn't necessarily listened to. But she did win in court. And I just, that story for me was a fascinating example of how fear and politics really screw up a public health response that should be rational. And that's the real problem with quarantine. When we spoke with Marty Citron, who Geoff mentioned earlier, the director of the Division of Global Migration and Quarantine at the CDC, and we spoke to him during the pandemic, and he sounded devastated, but he told us he had never realized how much the politics could mess up a public health response. And that's what we really saw with COVID-19.
Yes, we did. And we have a couple of audience questions about COVID, unsurprisingly. And one of the attendees wants to know why Italy in particular, especially given the history, got caught so flat-footed with COVID. Did they not have government ability to get people protected? Was it a hospital problem? And do you see any sort of comparison in terms of a better use of quarantine benefits, perhaps Taiwan, Israel, New Zealand? I mean, what was going on there?
I think Italy, just in this particular instance, it was just unlucky. It was the first Western place that got hit particularly hard through an unfortunate sequence of, travel. And at that point, Western authorities were not taking this seriously enough. So I don't think that authorities in the US were necessarily any better prepared. It's just that that's the first place where COVID-19 really picked up there. That's what I'd say about Italy. I would say that when Chinese officials visited Italy and said, here's what to do, this is what we've learned from our experience in Wuhan, you need to centralize quarantine, and you need to put everyone who's potentially being exposed into a quarantine hospital together so that they just to crack down on potential transmission. The Italians said, no, we can't do that culturally. It just won't work. And the Chinese said that is what they had done, and that is what they had found to work. And the Italians said no. So, But yeah, you want to jump in on why New Zealand and Taiwan in particular worked?
Yes, I could. I actually, to be honest, I kind of wanted to jump back actually just to something I thought was very interesting. Not to avoid that question, but just that there was one thing that came up that was during the Casey Hickox thing that was fascinating, at least for me, was actually that we learned about the story actually initially through the Chief Justice of Maine, who had sort of officiated, so to speak, or judged over her time in the state of Maine where she actually lived. And what was interesting is that at the time, he pointed out that he had to go back through all these archives he basically got a call. There's a woman who is going to break quarantine. What do we do? Can we keep her in her house? This is well before COVID-19, and so he had to dust off all the books and stay up all night reading about state quarantine law in order to figure out exactly what they even could do for someone who was threatening to potentially spread Ebola, or violate state quarantine laws. But that touched on a lot of really interesting things, I think, where we also learned at that same conference that, and Nikki mentioned that Casey was in a scenario where she was going to be presented with a stay-at-home order. But no one wanted to serve the actual documents and actually say, hey, we're here to tell you to stay home. There were people that just didn't want to do that because they didn't want to endanger themselves. They themselves might get swept up in the hysteria. But what's really
people
interesting,
were calling out sick to work because they just didn't want to be the ones near an Ebola, a potential Ebola person.
But it was almost like a Kafka story because you have laws on the books, but then and sheriffs in some states, but not other states, are obligated to engage in quarantine enforcement. But then if you actually tell them, hey, you have to go enforce this quarantine, and has happened in recent history, they just a refusal. We're not going to do that. We're not health officials, and I'm not going to endanger, our officers or, by sending them to fight an invisible threat. But so in any case, there were a lot of very interesting things about just like how quarantine is actually enforced in the first place. And the fact that it's on a federal level, it's actually a quite tidy and well thought through power. But then it's state and local health authorities who actually implement a lot of these things, in which case they don't have the federal resources, or they have competing and contradictory laws on the books that don't allow them to do that. And, we're still in that boat. I don't know if COVID-19 will necessarily be a wake-up call for kind of combing through jurisdictional problems and levels of government problems, but it'll be really interesting just to see what comes of this experience and whether or not we get our quarantine act together.
The more devolved quarantine powers are down to the local level, the less effective the response generally is, and that has also so far been proven true during COVID-19.
So the Chinese dictate to Italy was certainly correct, whether or not Italians wanted to do it.
Well, yeah,
So a question about your personal choices during COVID and whether your research informed them at all. I can say from experience that every so often Nikki would say to me, well, I'm writing a book on quarantine. I can't do that. I don't even remember what that was. But so how did all your research affect your experience this year? Did you find ways to not be bored? Did you pay close attention to how you were quarantining, or how strictly you quarantined?
We definitely, we wrote a book, which a lot of people have done in quarantine in the past.
I did not.
There's a track record there of people finding that time to actually finally write their book, and we did too. I will say, when I would say that I can't do that, it was to do with breaking the quarantine rules. And I think a lot of times people think these rules are silly and arbitrary and all these stupid color coding things, and you can do this thing in this municipality, but not in this municipality. And who's to say that like 3 households is so much worse than 2 households, for heaven's sake? And especially if one of those households doesn't have kids. I mean, like people, you look at these micro regulations and they look ridiculous. But having, spent so much time sort of in the trenches with public health officials and realizing that the rules are always, it's a blunt instrument, and yet it works. And that's just kind of the nature of quarantine. It's asking something of us that feels unfair and feels arbitrary and feels frustrating and boring and all the rest. And yet it's very effective and has proven so over history. And so it ended up to me feeling like, oh, it's the least I can do, especially since it would really be embarrassing to have like the headlines, quarantine author breaks quarantine.
Did you find any research, this is another question from one of the attendees, but that there were any international or national or regional organizations that were particularly good and that you could imagine taking a key role in leading quarantine in the future, that were particularly thoughtful on the topic?
Well, I think actually, one of the things that we talk about toward the end of the book is the corporate response to quarantine and the corporate response to disrupting quarantine. So I'm not answering this in the sense that I would advocate these responses, but I think that the people who are taking on the mantle of quarantine, are people like Amazon, even companies like Palantir, companies that don't have almost the opposite of a good reputation when it comes to customer privacy, labor rights, these kinds of things. I think that what we're going to see happen is that people see, especially in the United States, tend to have a trust of the private sector that they simply do not have for the public sector. And one of the things that we talk about is this rise of a kind of almost private quarantine complex where you've got companies that have networked smart home appliances that can respond to one another, that might be connected to your front door lock, that might be keeping track of your internet searches, but also your smart thermometer temperature gauge. And so you've got an issue, I think, where companies are going to step into the sphere and already are. Amazon patented a way for its smart speaker to identify signs of illness, but also depression in the sounds that are made by the owners of that smart speaker. And so, again, I'm not advocating this as like, okay, that's where I think we need to go, but I just think it's going to happen anyway. And so I think what we need to do actually is be prepared for understanding where some of these new innovations are going to be coming from, that they can be medically abused or medically implemented. And that we need to recognize the long-term effects that it will have when things that are come into existence in the name of quarantine tend to stick around. We talk about in the book how international borders that used to be sanitary inspection stations, the passport itself can be tied back to medical papers and health passports, health papers. And so QR codes that allow you to get onto the subway, or some way for your smart speaker to identify if you're coughing in a way that sounds like COVID-19. Then there's every chance in the world that will become permanent, and that 10 years from now, even without really realizing it, we kind of live in a quarantine version of the world. And I think that that's something that we should look for, or look out for.
So I want to lighten things up a little bit. This is a personal question, actually very personal. So I'd love you to describe how frequently you needed to disrobe in the course of reporting this book. What was going on there?
We were naked all the time. I mean, it's a husband and wife.
Makes it a little easier.
That was TMI. But no, we did end up having to take off our clothes a surprising number of times. And for biosecurity reasons, I think my favorite is probably the Serial Disease Lab, where we really, the Serial Disease Lab is this facility in St. Paul, Minnesota, where they work with the most deadly pathogens of wheat. So these are things that can kill 50% or upward of a harvest of wheat in a field. They actually only work with the most deadly ones in winter because then there's nothing green in Minnesota at that point. So it's an extra level of protection. Even if something does escape, it will die. But to get in there, they told us you can come in, but anything you bring in cannot come out. And so that included your underwear. And so we we stripped down to nothing and put on Tyvek suits and nothing. And then some Crocs, which Crocs are the universal footwear of biosecurity. And we wore a lot of Crocs, more Crocs than I had ever dreamed of wearing, honestly, during this process. So we put on some Crocs and went in, and you shower first and you shower on the way out. Even our notes, we were allowed to take notes as we went around, but then they were photographed and emailed to us and the paper was destroyed. So, but yeah, there was a bunch of nudity involved. Going to visit the Mars rover involved the one that's currently on the surface of Mars. They actually emailed us a list of what shower gels and what deodorants we are allowed to use to visit the Mars rover. Well, if you use particularly, I'm trying to think of a word that isn't smelly, strongly scented ones. Aromatic. There's a chance that the volatile chemicals will land on the rover actually, or one of its 23 camera lenses, and disrupt the valuable instrumentation. So you're actually only allowed to wear Mitchum unscented. And there were a whole list of shower gels. They're really against Old Spice. So you're not allowed to use.
So this is a question from an attendee, which I know you get asked a lot, especially because you started this before most of us were thinking about quarantine. What originally drew you to the topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. There's a whole bunch of things that I think drew us to the topic. The actual experience I think that really kind of kicked things off was just noticing a former quarantine station in outside Sydney, Australia, where we were traveling about 12 years ago, that had been turned into a hotel. So the very things that made it a good quarantine station, it's got wraparound verandas, it's got access to fresh air, it's out on a peninsula, it overlooks the sea, it's not in the city proper. The very things that therefore meant you could quarantine there now make it a great place for a spa hotel. And so now it's called Q Station, the hotel for people to stay at. But so the initial inspiration there was really, it touches on some of the themes we've already mentioned that are, what was quarantine? Why did it go out of favor? How is it that this station that was specifically designed and built for quarantine is now a hotel? Why do we no longer need to quarantine people there?
But then while we were in Australia, we started realizing, oh, quarantine's everywhere. And Australia is one of the most quarantine, I was going to say quarantine mad, but they are very, very keen on quarantine, let's put it that way, because they have had a lot of experience with, it's a very unique ecosystem that has been isolated from the rest of the world for a very long time. And so you bring in rabbits, are the classic example, and they just destroy the landscape. And so we were driving around Australia after that and seeing things like banana quarantine here and fruit and vegetable quarantine there. And I was realizing, as a person who cares about food, oh, quarantine's not just this thing from history. Quarantine is keeping our food safe today, which, small plug, if you want to hear how it's keeping our food safe today, you need to listen to our episode of Gastropod on that topic, and feel very, very afraid about the future of chocolate. But so then I realized, oh, there's more to this, and it just, the deeper we dove into it, the more it seemed like, oh, this is not just a thing from the past or a thing that keeps our food safe. It's a thing that also, NASA relies on to explore the universe, and a thing that has shaped our international borders, and a thing that has redefined our legal system. And so we dove in.
The NASA stuff is definitely, we don't have time for that tonight, but there's some really cool stuff there, including, what do you call it? The coolest job title? What was your?
Planetary Protection Officer.
Yeah,
Planetary Protection Officer. Totally fun to read about, and also did make me think about which planets were being protected. Like quarantine, it's protecting Earth, it's protecting Mars,
both ways. Yeah.
Both ways.
Yeah.
Although now with this sort of frustration amid the private space community, there's a sense that we might kind of create sacrifice zones on other planets, and only protect parts of them going forward. So stay tuned. Planetary quarantine's a hot topic.
So you did mention food, and there's a lot about food, and there's a lot we could talk about, but someone was wondering if imported foods are effectively monitored this century and quarantined if necessary.
I mean, something under 2% of all the containers that arrive in the port of New York and New Jersey are inspected for quarantine purposes, for example. So effectively, no. For certain things, countries step up quarantine procedures. For example, at the moment, the biggest pandemic that no one has heard of, we're all worried about COVID-19, but actually African swine fever has already wiped out a quarter of the world's pigs, and is really kind of incredibly difficult. I mean, it's a very tenacious little bug. It, even on frozen pork products, it will survive, or sausages you can bring it into the country on, which would think, how does it do that? But it does. And so particularly in Australia, the quarantine against African swine fever and pork products is very stringent indeed. But I would say mostly, especially with food, there's this calculus that we're going to use quarantine as much as we can, but basically only to buy time. This is, again, something we talk about in the episode, but it's something where we know stuff is slipping through. We're just trying to buy ourselves time to develop either treatments, pesticides, various things that we can use to kind of kill whatever bug this is, or resistant varieties, or an entirely new variety, or in the case of, for example, bees, a variety that has a behavior that makes it resistant. It's just a method of buying time. It's very rare that a food item is valuable enough to really warrant true quarantine, and chocolate actually is one of the examples, which is what makes it so interesting.
It is really fascinating and definitely fun to read about, fun to listen to. So, this has come up a few times, that there are these experiences or these pandemics or, quarantine experiences that happen and then are forgotten. One of the attendees is wondering if this kind of group amnesia, if it actually happens, are we imagining things, or is this a real problem? Are we going to remember what we're going through now with quarantine and really be able to apply that in the future, or are we going to kind of move on?
I mean, yeah, I think that's one of the big problems, actually, and one of the reasons why quarantine appeared to be an obsolete, forgotten medieval tool, with an exotic history that wasn't relevant to the modern world, because often, we talked about quarantine structures. There are not a lot of them around anymore. They're actually they're lost to architectural history, and thus, in a sense, lost to history itself. When people come out of a pandemic, one of the last things in the world they want to do is actually think about the pandemic or think about what they've just been through. I think we're seeing it now with COVID-19, as lockdown rules are effectively coming to an end. We're back in a mask mandate here in California, but you see places like England that have basically just thrown open the doors. People are in party mode. Basically, they want to go back to a different way of being. They want to have a different kind of life again. And so I think that the amnesia is real. People move on. They destroy records. The quarantine stations themselves are gone. It was interesting that Marty Citron at the CDC pointed out that when he was trying to figure out how to make quarantine better, how to improve it, how to reform it, how to give it more, more comfort for the people that it's targeted at. He had to go back and just read through dozens and dozens of old newspapers from the 1918 flu. Go back through microfiche and actually kind of put together his own amateur history of what actually happened back then. What did they do in Philadelphia that they didn't do in St. Louis, or vice versa? How did that affect the curve in each city? So my point there is simply that it is a real danger that we won't save the things that we need to use as historians or as people who want to think about quarantine and improve it in the future, because we'll just get rid of all of it. And I think that that's one of the things that we really need to do now, is use this as an opportunity to reflect on what we've been through and not let this moment pass, so that we can improve quarantine and we can be more prepared for the next pandemic, which is inevitable and will likely hit within our own lifetime.
Not to end on a doom and gloom note, but I do think that the thing about quarantine is it's never a heroic narrative. You never are like, wow. And yet it is, because it's this immense self-sacrifice for the public good. It just doesn't feel heroic. And that's one of the reasons in the book we tried to kind of call out quarantine heroes, because that is the kind of history we remember as a culture and as humans. These kind of bold, heroic gestures, rather than the, I'll take extra precautions and stay at home. That's not the kind of history that gets written down. And so I think that's part of why, quarantine doesn't figure, despite having shaped the world that we live in today and shaped a lot of the institutions that govern our movement. It doesn't get taught as one of those forces, because it just feels so passive and kind of nervous Nelly-ish.
But you have lots of great thoughts about how to think about it differently and do things differently. And I am going to end, sorry, we couldn't cover all the questions. We're basically out of time. So I'm going to end with something light and fun. And if you could just say, what was your favorite thing that you ate while reporting this book?
Yeah.
I think you're on a good gastropod question.
That is
any good meals you remember?
Oh my God. Well, Geoff always says, pick your book topic by where you want to travel to.
Totally smart.
It's good advice.
Italy, very good. Italy, Croatia sounds great.
Malta.
Oh, Malta.
Right, Malta. I remember hearing about that meal.
Malta is kind of a fascinating place because it's closer to North Africa than it is to Europe, but then it has this Mediterranean influence too, and that blend of North African and Mediterranean, it's you don't hear a lot about Maltese cuisine. Maybe that's my hot tip: Maltese cuisine. Let's do it.
Yeah, Malta was great. I love like fig rolls and stuff. So Malta has a lot of figs, which is quite exciting for me. We actually ate well in Omaha, in my opinion.
Gnarly.
Omaha is kind of an overlooked city in the middle of the country, obviously, but I feel like the food scene there is quite exciting. There was a nice bakery that we discovered, and so yeah, I'd say there are many places where we ate and drank well.
I'm glad to hear it. It's the importance of a reporting trip, as I know from being on reporting trips with both of you. So
exactly.
Well, thank you. I am going to wrap up.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for both, all three of you, for being here tonight and giving us this fantastic and fascinating discussion. I'm still kind of stuck on the idea that erotica in quarantine is a recurring theme. That's wild.
COVID-69, folks.
Oh my God. Well, thank you so much for being here. Any final words before we tune off?
Yeah, if you want to read more about the book, you can go to untilprovensafe.com.
Right, we link to excerpts there, and you should definitely go to gastropod.com, where you can listen to an episode all about the quarantines that keep our food safe. But yeah, and
then go to all the Harvard links and buy the books through Harvard.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Cynthia, Nicola, Geoff, thank you again for your time. And thank you to everyone at home who's watching tonight and showing up for authors, publishers, indie book selling, and the incredible staff here at Harvard Bookstore. The link is in the chat if you would like to purchase a copy of Until Proven Safe. Please remember to shop indie and shop local. And from all of us at Harvard Bookstore, be well, stay safe, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.